I'm tired, but Peanut insists we do another video. See? And since we covered Star Wars, Indiana Jones, now it's time to revisit something Star Trek, pay homage to our fallen friends at Eaglemoss. Right, Peanut? I think she's actually a fan of the Romulans, but we're going to do Starfleet. And since the video needed to be something I could bring out to the cabin, we're going to talk about shuttlecraft. Something actually very important in space travel, in the real world, and in Star Trek. And it begins here, in the mid-22nd century, with the Earth Shuttle Pod, retroactively named the Class A Shuttle after the Federation. And this basic design, with updates, would remain in service for about half a century. It was sublight only, originally capable of about only quarter impulse. Later versions could bump that up to a third, even maybe half. About 6 meters long, designed for space and air flight, and even originally designed at a time before the transporter was really called upon for transporting people. So it could rather comfortably seat half a dozen, and in an emergency, more so. It had hull plating, basic armor, and it had plasma weaponry. This is before phasers or phase cannons could be on such a small vessel. And Starfleet ships pre-Federation would always carry a couple of these, because again, the transporter wasn't the standard. And this is where it all began. Next up, we have the Class B, a cargo or passenger freight shuttle. It was generally based on the Class A, intended to operate in an atmosphere, especially atmosphere to orbit and back. And like the A, it was not capable of light speed, but it was a mite faster, and would come into service in the early days of the United Federation of Planets. And it was roughly 12 meters long, so about double that of the earlier pod, and could carry quite a large number of passengers if configured to do so, or a large number of freight, and usually required a crew of at least 2 to operate. But because of its size, it was really not best suited for operation aboard starships. Rather, it operated on planets and star bases. It had no real defensive capabilities, rudimentary armor, essentially no armament. It was a workhorse, a workaday shuttlecraft that replaced at least some of the roles of the earlier shuttle pod, but not nearly all of them. For early deep space missions on board starships and starbases, we had the Class C shuttle. And it kind of split the difference in size. It was larger than the pod, but smaller than the cargo, and could be configured for various roles and purposes, but its primary duty, one way or another, was to carry personnel. But the interesting fact about the Type C, it was the first shuttle to be mass-produced with the ability to go FTL with the warp drive. It was somewhat limited and not much over Warp 1, but it was there. And these were in service in the early to mid 23rd century. And were, frankly, a relatively advanced design created with input from the Andorians and Vulcans, Tellarites, and other founding members of the Federation. And by this point, the transporter was rather well trusted. So the shuttle, in addition to being a backup, started to be used for rather specialized roles. The next step forward would not take long with the Class D. It was somewhat larger, sleeker, somewhat more powerful warp, and it had rudimentary defenses and offensive capabilities. Whereas the Class C was usually fitted aboard exploratory or colony ships, science ships, this could be fitted on board more defensive, patrol, police, that kind of thing. So it was literally just an upscaled and somewhat modernized version introduced in the 2250s. So about 20-30 years more advanced than the previous one. And it shows in a lot of the lines, but it also isn't a revolution forward. And because of its size, getting close to 12 meters again, it really could only be stationed on the largest, newer vessels like the Constitution class that was coming into service around that time, and a few others. That meant that the older and smaller shuttles were still very valuable for many ships and even smaller outposts and stations. But you can really see a design lineage forming here. Up to this point, they're still kind of configurable, but jacks of all trade shuttles too. Just as the Class C and D were rather closely related, our next two will be as well. This is the Class E shuttle. A bit of a new direction, although still very, very much based on what we've seen before. And continuing to get rather large and long, working as a freight shuttle, cargo shuttle. Really one of the first that could go warp speed and deliver a large amount of cargo, freight, personnel, and could be used in deep space and stationed on board larger vessels. But a lot of these ended up on station duty. And in a lot of ways, this had the most advanced kind of computers and design specs for a shuttle, such as it is. And with that, there is some risk of parts failure, breakages, replacements. You know, being the first isn't always the best, just like adopting the latest version of Windows. Right, Peanut? So that would be a perfectly good shuttle to equip vessels with that were serving in and near the Federation. But what about those going on long duration? Say, 5-year voyages. You think, Peanut? You like 5-year voyages? Right. You know I have to do it, right? Bally. Enter the Class F shuttle, the one everyone knows from the mid 23rd century. This was a relatively compact, about 7 meters, but very durable, very dependable, kind of old school technology, tried and tested. It could comfortably carry 7, 8 people in an emergency more. It was capable of relatively high warp for a shuttle. At this point, we're getting shuttles that can at least do, warp 2, warp 3, maybe warp 4. And they're configured not just to land on a planet, but a hostile, inhospitable even, planet. So a lot of effort and energy was put into making their hulls very sturdy. And while they were larger than the original Class A, they were still small enough they could fit on board most starships and star bases. And even for larger vessels like a Constitution class, they could afford to carry stacks of these. Of course, again, by this point, the transporter was the main transport thing. However, it's amazing the number of times that a shuttle was required because something was wrong with the transporter. It was the holodeck of its day. As a result, this at first seemingly humble craft became an instrument of Starfleet, an iconic one. Even Peanut agrees, right, Peanut? And it would serve throughout the 23rd century and inspire generations of shuttles to come. By this point, it has some basic shielding and can be equipped with relatively low yield defensive phasers. Our next design would represent the advancements of the E with the solid dependability, versatility of the Class F with the Class G. This would be the version used in the late 23rd century and into the early 24th. It was just over 9 meters long, so it could carry a dozen individuals comfortably, more in an emergency. It had yet more effective warp engines, essentially scaled down versions of what were in use on most Starfleet ships of the day, so it had very respectable speed for what it was. At the same time, it had a very reinforced hull, adequate shielding, even small phasers in a pinch. And it's one of the first to kind of do the fully opened canopy for viewing. And then the cabin in the back could be configured past the bulkhead for whatever you might need. And these shuttles would appear for a very long time, especially in far-flung outposts. They were just dependable. And it kind of comes down to the, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. With the dawn of the 24th century, and what is known as the Golden Age of Starfleet, the Class G would be renamed as the Type 4 shuttle, as a new naming convention would roll in. And a slightly updated version would come into service in the early to mid 24th century. The Type 5 here. Still using the now traditional iconic nacelles seen on so many Starfleet ships. After all, at this time, the Miranda, the Excelsior, the Oberth, and many others were still in very, very common use, even newly made. So the updates had to mostly do with the cockpit and canopy. Extra windows were added for visibility, updated controls, even sometimes touch-sensitive controls were integrated. So this was an evolution forward, not a wild step forward. Really still tracing its roots back to the Class E and Class F. And it continues to be faster. This version actually had quite durable shielding for scientific missions or rescue missions. These were plenty large enough to rescue refugees, provide medical aid, so on and so forth. And would stay in service, at least in some capacity, for 50 years or more, almost outlasting the 24th century itself. And as we have it here, this is the first 150 years, give or take, of Starfleet shuttle design. It went from absolutely necessary to a specialist role, a backup role, and its role would continue to change and even expand into the 24th century, although much of the basic design would hang on. Nuts, what you doing? Peanut? What you doing? Don't chew the little shuttles. Ready to go, Peanut? Let's do it. For the 24th century, an all-new line of shuttles was introduced, beginning with the Type 6. A simple, boxy, dependable, considered a light shuttle. It was capable of sustaining warp 3, although in relatively short few-hour bursts it could go much faster. It could mount 2 light phasers. It had shielding. It could even use what was essentially an emergency short-range transporter, really the first we see in a shuttlecraft. It was about 6 meters long and could carry up to 6 crew, so really the same specs as the early shuttle pod, size included, but a much more capable craft, small enough that any starship could really carry these, or larger ones could have multiples, and they could be configured. And frankly, they were cheap to manufacture, and Starfleet would never use the phrase disposable, but they were kind of disposable, especially if the pilot's name was Chakotay. This was the basic light version in the family. But if you needed to go further and faster, you had the Type 7. This was considered a medium-size, medium-range shuttle. It was about 8.5 meters long, capable of sustaining warp 4 and faster in shorter bursts. It actually had internal bulkheads and compartments and essentially rooms, a small toilet, even a small limited purpose replicator, because they knew that these could be traveling for several hours or even a couple of days, or even could be used if landed on a planet as a bit of a campsite for a while. Because of their extra amenities, typically they only had a crew of 6 as well, but they could easily carry 8, even 10 in a pinch if people didn't mind sharing or the bulkheads were removed, because they were bigger. And just a more capable vessel. A little bit of a different line to it. Has a look more for entering an atmosphere with more rounded edges and what have you, but was quite a popular do-everything shuttlecraft, but also resource-intensive enough that someone had to really have a need to requisition one. And it really fit that gap. Next, we have the first of 2 extremes in the family, the Type 15 Shuttle Pod. This is the smallest one we've looked at just about 3.5 meters. And it really only ever has a crew of 1, maybe 2, at most 3. But typically you have 1 pilot and then a cargo pallet in the back. And there's no engine back here, just a hatch. These nacelles are not for warp. They're for thrust and impulse speed. Yeah, this is the first time in a while that we've seen a sublight only craft. But the idea was these could rapidly transport sensitive material from station to station, ship to station, or even space to a planet side, and make multiple trips in a day with pilots. A pretty specialist thing. They could also be used for short-ranged observation, repair duties, and because they were so small and light, any vessel, even the smallest Starfleet ship, could carry a couple, and a large vessel like a Galaxy class could carry dozens. And, well, quantity does indeed have a quality all its own. And to wrap up this section of the family, and these are all pretty well introduced around the same time in the mid-24th century, we have the Type 9, or rather retroactively named the Type 9A, cargo transport shuttle. This is much like the Class B, except this is definitely capable of warp. Now it's slower at about 2.5 sustained, but it was really made to aid in construction and getting heavy freight, anywhere from 6 to 9 tons. It usually only had a crew of 2, sometimes 3, and then a very sturdy bulkhead because the back could be easily and was routinely open to space. It could even carry smaller things like work bees in the back, and there was even a variant used for troop transport in combat situations. Still, it's basically just an upscaled Type 6. I don't think it shows. But hey, why not? It lost a little bit of speed, but made up for it in being able to really chunk things across space. And it had quite a good medium range transporter. It's becoming more and more of a standard feature with shuttles, at least by the year 2360. At first, the shuttle was pretty much a straight line, being developed and improved over a a century. But then the tree branched out quite quickly. You have a couple of light transports, a medium, and then a heavy. And these could all be carried on board the same vessel if it had a room for them. I should point out that the Type 9A really could only fit the Galaxy, the Nebula, other rather large vessels. But the Type 6 and the Type 15, they could fit anything. Even the Type 7 wasn't too demanding, although you might not get one on, say, a Miranda class. But the 2370s saw a lot of rapid change. The more things change, the more they stay the same with the Type 8. This was essentially an updated Type 6. Same basic space frame. Slightly longer. Somewhat updated canopy cockpit. But a whole new generation of warp nacelles, which allowed it to go about warp 4 sustained, which was a full scale more than the Type 6. Also, phasers turned to be standard on these, better shielding. Still, really just carried a crew of 6. Again, same basic size, so yeah, just a highly updated version. And it would serve on multiple small starships and star bases beginning in the 2370s. And it also had a much improved, more robust transporter system, because you never know when a shuttle might need that. But you know, the lines of the old Class F, they're still kind of here. Neat. And the Type 15 received an update with the Type 18 shuttle pod. It too really only had a crew of 1 or 2, maximum of 4. It was slightly longer at 4.5 meters. It did carry phasers as standard, and it did have limited, or at least slow, warp capabilities, but it was really only more for an emergency use. However, the Type 18 pod was created with the idea that it might need to be deployed in a combat situation, if not directly as an offensive asset, obviously, at least in like a rescue mission type deal, or to evade. So they were tough for what they were, but the necessity of being a shuttle pod, rather limited. Which explains our next version here, the Type 9. Like I said earlier, the original cargo shuttle was retroactively renamed. This is actually quite a long craft, deceptively so, because of the engine and manifolds back there. It's about 9 meters, yet it only has a crew of 4. It's actually quite tight inside. Not even any room to stand. Nevertheless, it is classed as a long-range medium shuttle because speed. It can sustain warp 6, which is about the best we've seen out of a shuttle. So it traded internal volume and somewhat comfort for speed. To be fair, even if you're uncomfortable, does it really matter if your voyage is less? It also had a very good medium, even long-range transporter. Phasers were again standard. Shields were quite good. It was definitely designed to outrun or run into places and defend itself if needed. It was not designed with heavy personnel transport or even cargo transport in mind. That's just not what it was. For that, the Type 8 was probably still a little better. But if you had a message or a vital part, yep, the Type 9 would be your man. And it's interesting because even though they were very long, they were so short that they could still manage to fit on board even smaller starships. And they definitely had some combat orientation. They had plenty of peacetime uses and implications. Though, to be honest, not so our next shuttle. Considered a medium-ranged heavy shuttle, this is the Type 10. In the basic space frame, really it was taken from the Type 6 or Type 7, but we have very compacted, high-efficiency armored nacelles. You have an armored hull, and this is over 9 meters long, but really only has a routine crew of 4. Much of its internal volume is taken up by armor, jamming gear, computer gear, and yes, weapons systems. This has a couple of phaser arrays and even micro-photon torpedo launchers. And it's quite maneuverable, gives a quite thin profile, and it's capable of reaching a very respectable warp 5. So not quite like the Type 8, but its idea was to dart into a battlefield or into an extremely hostile planet environment and pick up or deliver something and get out. So it would need to take a beating. And most of the extra equipment on board was for that purpose. These could also be used for espionage, spying. They're pretty much used on dedicated combat vessels and small ones like the Defiant class, the Saber class, the Steam Runner, the Akira, ones that were at the front lines in the 2370s during the Borg incursion and the Dominion War, and then the subsequent troubles with Romulus, or rather what was left of it eventually. Yeah, unique shuttle design, but really it's not too hard to look at it and kind of see its roots. Next, as we get towards the end, the Type 11 Heavy Long-Range Shuttle. And this is only really a shuttle just. At 16 meters, it's by far the longest and heaviest we've seen. Had a routine crew of around 10, although more could obviously go on board if needed. It was capable of Warp 6, and in a lot of ways, it's a scaled up and flushed out Type 9. It had multiple compartments, bulkheads, and it had phasers and micro photon launchers as standard, so taking that from the Type 10. These were really only seen on board the larger vessels for obvious reasons, and were kind of a sleeker, somewhat scaled back take on a Danube runabout. But whereas the Danube class can really be considered to be a small independent starship with this registry. This would be about as big as you could get and still officially be a shuttle. But it was very capable. It could easily serve as a base of operation for weeks on a planet. It could travel quite far from its mothership. And again, it could easily transport 10, 11 folks. Yeah, it had a lot going on, all things considered. Because you're looking at a place that has an internal volume of a not small apartment. Very good shields, a very advanced computer core for being a shuttle, and something that really comes into service after at least the major part of the fighting of the Dominion War is over. And then finally, the Type 17 heavy freight, heavy cargo shuttle. Again, kind of going back to some of the early ones. It even had folding wings for flight in air, and while it is warp capable, it's not the fastest, even though it is the largest, technically, 20 meters. But much like the Type 9A, it sacrifices speed and agility to haul its passengers and cargo. And this is a relatively rare shuttle, simply because it's a very specialized configuration that's going into service in the early 2380s. And was not designed primarily with the combat role in mind. But it could definitely do it if it needed to. And it kind of supplements all the advancements over the 20 or so year time span. And Peanut is zonked out. So yeah, there's a revisit. Low key at the cabin. Why not? Starfleet shuttles. Often overlooked, sometimes even underrated. Very important part of space travel. And because the shuttles usually had to be, at least in the early days, interacted with by actual actors, they had their own unique challenges. That's why, for the most part, they end up looking like minivans in space. But that's okay. I think, like a lot of people, my favorite is the TMP era. The Galileo 5. It's just hard to beat. Although the Hawking variant seen in Generations is pretty cool too. I like that little bit of touch and new that it has. Some of the Voyager and DS9 designs are interesting, but very kind of a time. And I went ahead and included the JJ versions because why not? I don't hate them. And we needed some early shuttles, so hey, why not? Anyway, guys, it's been a long day, so I'll let you go. Hope you enjoyed this completely impromptu and just wacky going through. I mean, what can be really said about them? They're boxes in space. Of course, there's a lot of memes that can be said about Shuttlecraft and Voyager. That's for darn sure. Yeah. But probably for another day, another time. Miss Peanut's already gone to bed, so I'm gonna follow suit. This is Misha, and we'll both catch you very soon. Next time.